Cost-benefit analysis. Now, this is something that you probably don't think of a whole lot, and usually if you're given an assignment to do something, you don't stop and say, okay, let me analyze the cost-benefit analysis. But it's something that, for some types of procurements, it is something that you need to take in consideration, because this is part of the issue of, do you do something or do you not do it? Like yesterday, we were talking about the PBIS contract, and we decided not to do it. Part of that issue was the potential that was going to work and return benefit versus the potential was going to cost money and not pay from a benefit standpoint what it cost. So for things, and we have an example here of an IT project, and this is something that you can have like a tangible type of projection for cost benefit. And very simple, cost benefit is what it says. How much is something going to cost versus how much is it, once it's implemented, is it going to save? And obviously, you have two issues involved here. Your initial projection of, do you even start a procurement to begin with? And you try an estimate, and obviously here, you're making estimates of primarily what it's going to cost. You hopefully have a pretty good target of, or a pretty good estimate of what benefit you're going to get. That's why you want to undertake it. But you have less, probably, a good projection of how much is it going to cost from a vendor standpoint to do it. So you're going to have some kind of estimate, and if the estimate looks like it's going to be a pretty good cost-benefit ratio, you may undertake it, and when you undertake it, then you get the actual prices from vendors, and then you're going to make a more informed decision of, does it make sense to go forward and still do this? So these are the things, and now let me tell you what it is, now that I've hopefully given you an overview of what's involved. So this is a comparison between the cost of a project and the estimated value or benefit that will result from the expenditure, the benefit for the cost. And the example we've thrown up here is, let's say that we estimate that an IT project, information technology project, is going to save $300,000 a year in payments to in payments to a contractor or in the cost of salaries, etc., and benefits for state employees, anything that would go from a cost standpoint. So $1 million, $300,000 a year. And then we have to, before we decide whether this makes sense, we have to say, what's the useful life of this IT project? How long will it last before we have to do it again or have to do something else? And if we project a 5-year useful life, so $1 million expenditure, $300,000 a year savings, times 5 years, $1.5 million projected savings for a projected $1 million expenditure, and you would have a cost-benefit analysis, a ratio, of 1 to 1.5. 1 for the cost, 1.5 for the benefit. So the basic question, if you have a 1 to 1.5 ratio from your estimate, is it worth doing? And how many people think it would be worth doing? How many people have no idea what I'm talking about? How many people will even admit? One person admits. The answer here is, well, it depends. I think that's the answer. Maybe. You remember the other class? It was always, it depends. This one's maybe. Is there another project that would yield a higher ratio? And the thing that comes down to is, how good are your estimates? How good are your projections? How firm is the useful life of 5 years? If you were being very conservative, if you really think it's going to last 5, 7, 8 years, then obviously your benefit starts increasing. If it's maybe 5 years is even stretching it, maybe it might be 4 years, then you're getting a lot closer to the cost than the benefit. Will the entire cost of the state employees be eliminated? Because you may be projecting that you're going to eliminate, not that you're going to fire X number of state employees, but you're going to use them for something else. But then you always have the issue of, do you need, for instance, a contract manager? Since we said yesterday, and we will say more in this class and much, much more in the Perform class, you need someone to oversee the contractor, to make sure they're doing what they're supposed to be doing. So maybe at least one person has to still be retained under this activity just to manage the contractor. And maybe one person plus part of accounts payable, and maybe part of the MBE liaison, and maybe part of the procurement officer, all because you have this contract. So maybe you can't eliminate all the employees. So maybe we're starting to getting a little closer to this 1 million cost, 1 million benefit, etc. Some activities may still need to be done with the employees. Ongoing employee support may be needed for the new IT project. There may be, and this is conjecture, this is just throwing out, there may be too much risk that a projected ratio of 1 to 1.5 may not materialize and may actually cost more than the benefit derived. For instance, if, and so what you might do as a policy or a standard is set up something that we're not going to undertake something unless we think it's at least a 2 to 1 ratio, 3 to 1 ratio, etc., because there's too much leeway for it to go the minimum type rather than the maximum projection of savings, and so we don't want to risk the time and effort of doing a procurement and everything that goes into it for a possibility that when we get to the point of awarding that we're going to say this isn't worth doing. I thought I had something else there. Oh, there it was. Maybe. So I forgot to read this on this slide. Recheck your projections. How firm is the useful life estimate of 5 years? If the program becomes obsolete in 3 years instead of 5, the benefit would be $900,000, even discounting the fact you may still need some employees to monitor the contract, etc., versus the $1 million cost. So obviously, if you have a best case scenario and a worst case scenario, and the worst case scenario is it's going to cost money to undertake, you're probably not going to undertake that procurement at all. So this is part of what you're going to look at depending upon what you're asked to procure. What is the benefit? What is the likelihood it's going to pay for itself? If there's a federal mandate, you're going to do it regardless. If there's some other thing, if it's a political thing where it's implementing a program that the legislature says do, you're probably not going to do a cost-benefit analysis unless it is versus of doing with state employees versus doing a contractor, etc. But there are some procurements where this makes sense to do this. And your job as procurement people, as contract managers, as program people, is to try to figure out when you're in the planning stage, is it something that falls into this cost-benefit scenario type of situation where you should do this type of analysis versus no, this isn't something where we need to even bother with this. So this is what cost-benefit analysis is. And now we'll go back and look at a couple examples. And here's examples of where there is a cost-benefit analysis. The first one I think should resonate with some of you, hopefully. But when I was here anyway, the projections that were used was for each dollar of cost for a contract for preventative health care would save $9 in actual treatment of problems, of paying for physicians, paying for hospital care, etc. So a 9-to-1 ratio is a real good ratio. That's something that says you go ahead and do contracts for preventive health care to try to prevent the acute type situations where people have to go to emergency rooms and physicians to cure things that could have been prevented. Department of Human Resources, they undertook a contract where scenario is that when they had kids in foster care, that many times the courts would appoint an attorney to look after the interests of the child in foster care. And when the courts appointed an attorney, they would say what expenses the attorney was allowed to get, i.e. how much they were allowed to be paid per hour, which might be $200, something like that. And so what the Department of Human Resources said to themselves is, each time the court appoints an attorney, we're basically paying through the nose for that attorney to do this work on behalf of this child. So what they did, starting out initially, maybe 10 years or more ago, was do a contract to try to get attorneys to, through a competitive process, agree to take on these type of cases, and price was a very important element in which attorneys would get the award to do this. And what they found out was that the contracts they awarded to attorneys through a competitive process basically were about 1/3 to 1/4 the cost per hour as the attorneys that were simply appointed by the courts. And so after they did this as a pilot project to see, will it pay to go out and do this type of procurement? Will we get lawyers that come back and compete, and what kind of prices will they charge? And when they did this on a pilot basis, they found that they were saving $3 to $4, 3/4 almost of the expense of what they were paying for the court-appointed attorneys. And so they expanded it to the whole state. And they've done it now probably 3 different iterations of 3-year contracts since that time. And the other thing they had to do was convince the judges to not appoint somebody other than the attorneys that were under their contract. And that was part of the challenge as well. It's one thing to have a contract to do the work, but since the judges are the ones that determine what attorney is going to look after a particular child, they had to go to the attorneys and convince them, we have good attorneys, we save a lot of money, it helps the state, it still benefits the child, use our attorneys. And so the courts gradually started doing that, so now everything that happens, unless there's some extraordinary circumstance, is the courts simply use the attorneys that Human Resources gets through their competitive contract. So it made sense to do it. And in fact, cost benefit in this respect wasn't a true cost benefit because they didn't guarantee these lawyers any work. So actually, if the lawyers weren't used, they didn't pay them anything. So there really was no cost versus the benefit in that scenario. One where there was, and this last one up there, is Department of Labor Licensing and Regulation. A number of years ago, started out with a project to automate their licensing system for architects and landscape engineers and everything that goes under licensing and regulation. And they found out that spending money for information technology contracts to automate the licensing process saved them, depending upon the particular license that was involved, from $5 to $10 for every dollar that was spent on the contract, which obviously was an extremely good cost-benefit analysis. So that now virtually anything through labor licensing and regulation, they no longer even accept mail-type applications or mail-type renewals. Everything's done over the internet because it saves them a whole lot of money. So those are examples of cost-benefit analysis. In that case, should they have done that IT project to begin with to automate, to get things on the web? Yes, they should. And after they did it for one of their boards, saw the benefit, they just kept expanding it to everything they did because the benefit was there. Any questions on cost-benefit analysis? Okay. Oh, and you wanted the lights up. Are they okay? I just remembered. All right. So you don't want the lights up anymore. Total cost of ownership. And this is a different concept. This goes into the issue of how do you make an award to a vendor? And in your solicitation, you always have to say how the award's going to be made. And whether it is by sealed bidding, whether it's by sealed proposal, you're going to have a price element to the award. If it's a sealed bid procurement, the price is the element of the award. It's the only thing you consider as long as the vendor is responsive and responsible. If you have a sealed proposal, price is one of the 2 elements you will consider along with technical capability. But in any case, you're going to have a price that you're going to look at. So what total cost of ownership does is look at not just perhaps the initial price, not who is the cheapest for the initial delivery of something, but who's going to be less expensive over a given period of time. And so what this does, and the most typical application of this is to buy equipment or something of that nature, where you have a tangible cost to buy it, but then you may have costs to install it, operate it, maintain it, remove it, dispose of it, things of this nature. And so total cost of ownership means that when you do your procurement, you say to the vendors, we're going to ask you to provide a cost, and both the cost to buy it, install it, etc. We're going to look at if there's a warranty or a maintenance contract, what is your cost of that? and you're going to tell them a specific duration, 3 years, 4 years, 5 years, etc. And you're also going to look at things like cost of electricity. If one piece of equipment is a lot more energy efficient than another piece of equipment, you're going to look at the energy cost to maintain it. If one piece of equipment needs special air conditioning, for instance, if it's information technology, and you need to build a room just for air conditioning to do it, and another one doesn't require that, you impute the cost of the air conditioning and everything to build out to accommodate it. If one takes a room this size and something else takes the room something the size of a table, there's a cost of the space and things of that nature. So total cost of ownership means everything that goes into having something for a given duration of time and comparing the final cost, taking all those elements into consideration. And the one thing that must occur for this is you must have objective measurements. So number one, those things that a vendor is going to quote a price, well, it's whatever price they quote. But anything that you're going to use, that you're going to impute, and I will explain that in a moment, has to be objective. For instance, if you're going to look at the electricity usage, then you must have some kind of demonstrated analysis or authoritative document or authoritative source that will tell you this energy usage. If one says it uses 20 kilowatts a day and another one says it uses 10 kilowatts a day, how trustworthy is the source of 20 versus 10? Is it the vendor themselves? If it's the vendor themselves, how do you know they're giving you the right information? Or is it some independent testing laboratory that has done an analysis and they're the ones that say 20 versus 10? And if it's a source that you can rely upon, then you get your energy cost, how much is it cost per kilowatt hour, multiply 20 times one, 10 times the other. If it's a 5-year lifespan, per day difference times 300 days times 5 years, etc., you come to a cost difference. If you have some kind of statement of resale value or disposal cost, and the one is a lot less than the other one, you can bring that into play. So the bottom line is you're looking at everything that goes into it. Things as simple as training. If one is a system you have and you're familiar with, and all your employees are involved with it, know how to use it. And if you go to a new system, then the people that use this have to be retrained. What is the cost of the training? How many days do they have to be out of the office? Do they have to pay the vendor to do the training? How much does the vendor charge for the training, etc.? Anything and everything goes into this analysis as long as it is authoritative and objective. And then what you come to is the bottom line. If your period of time is 5 years, at the end of 5 years, who has the least expensive product? And lots of times the vendor that is the cheapest initially is not the vendor that's the cheapest after 5 years, considering everything that goes into it. So that's total cost of ownership. And let me just see if I said anything that I haven't mentioned. Comparison cost given period of time may reveal that an item that is significantly more expensive to buy initially than another item may actually be cheaper in the long run. It can tell you whether an item is worth its cost differential over other comparable items. Refer to the handout that we have not, I didn't give Gary to copy to give you. So, but by next week, I will have given Gary the handout that he will then have to give you next Friday. Because I noted when I was reading this of handout, oh yes, we do have one of those things. Just didn't give it to him. Okay, now we're going to go to an exercise. So you've heard enough of me for this morning already. And what usually happens is I usually talk more than I guess I'm supposed to, so we're usually behind the 8 ball and from a time perspective. So what I'm going to ask you to do at this point, in the same groups that you had yesterday, that'll be kind of constant throughout this class, read this scenario and then focus initially on just point number 1. If you look in the back of this exercise, and it starts with the premise. your boss has called you in and has said your assignment is there's a retirement home for project managers, purchasing agents, and procurement officers. And we all know that's someplace we're going to go when we get a little older and want to retire. And it's nice to know that the Madison Hill Retirement Home for project managers, purchasing agents, and procurement officers is there for us when we're ready to retire. So your assignment from your boss is these 5 things, but we're going to focus initially on just the first one. Identify the short-term or immediate problem and the long-term problem, and discuss whether the above statement that we want operate a retirement home for project managers, purchasing agents, and procurement officers is the true problem. So why don't you take 15, 20 minutes to discuss, focusing just on number 1 after having read the little bit of scenario here, and then we will discuss what you think is the short-term, long-term problem and the true problem, etc. So, take it away. Let me just go through some slides here, and let's see if with these slides we might get into a different area of discussion on this same example. All right, possible long-range problems. And some of you touched on this. Why is there a home to begin with? Why does the state own a home, and why is this home focused on these individuals? So apparently the problem is taking care of certain individuals who were former state employees. And so at least when you're going and looking at this, and why we said long range and short range is you have, 278 people? Is that what the number was? 200 and some people currently living there. So you need to take care of the people that are currently there. You need to make sure the facility is maintained, the care is given, etc., of the people that are there. But one of the things that you can do, and I will take the liberty to say you can do because maybe these decisions have been made and you can't do it because you're just told, go get another contractor to operate the facility. But one of the things that you should at least bring up excuse me, is why does this situation exist? Is there a better way to take care of the problem of taking care of state employees who are going out to pasture and need taken care of? Can you do it in a different way than this facility? So some of the things we looked at, some of the things that we thought you might have said. And after we read them, then we'll see if you can relate to these and what your reaction would be to these. It may be better to pay to place these people in other existing private facilities. So that was something I think you kind of mentioned. Why are they here versus going elsewhere? So just as we said in that example of going to Chicago, maybe a solution is that instead of you making arrangements for a vendor to get everyone to Chicago by plane, train, whatever, maybe you just give them $500 and say, get there. However you want, take care of your own arrangements, we'll give you the money to do it. Maybe here we say we will pay for the whole thing, or we will subsidize you going elsewhere. And part of that issue is there vacancy elsewhere? Maybe that's the whole issue. Maybe we found out that there aren't enough slots, vacant facilities, private facilities, that you had to build a state one because there weren't places to go to. But at least you can look at that issue. Maybe, and this is something that has a lot of policy implications, maybe the issue is that, focusing on the first one, that you should take the people there now in this underutilized facility and put them somewhere else gradually and come up with a different use for this particular location. Maybe who knows, a veterans home, let's say, instead of the contract managers, etc. So, I mean, these are just things that you could have focused on in terms of what is the real problem. Again, I'm not saying that if you're in your contract fulfillment teams, you're going to have carte blanche to necessarily investigate to the nth degree what you've been told to do. But I will say that if you can come up with issues that you think that you should advise someone of, or at least make sure that they were aware of these when they gave the assignment, that you should do that. You should give some feedback to the people that gave you the assignment and say, now we've come up with these considerations, and I know you probably looked at this, but just thought you ought to know, we thought this, and this, that maybe we should explore these. Do you want me to go and look, our contract fulfillment team, to look at these in more depth, or should we just stop now, just stop looking further, accept the assignment to go and get another vendor to operate the facility and be done with it? And sometimes you might find out that no, they weren't aware that there was a proper way to look at it in a different light. So you bring it up might mean, okay, well, let's do the short one, let's contract to operate, but now that you mention it, let's also focus on these other aspects. Or maybe they'll tell you, yes, we're already looking at those. And so we have another group exploring those parts of it. You just take care of the short term. Make sure you at least bring it up so that someone's aware that there are other possibilities. Determine why procurement officers and contract managers need such a facility when other state personnel don't. And that was mentioned as well. Why, in this ridiculous example, and as I said, it was ridiculous to exaggerate, to make, and I noticed some of you got a good laugh out of some of the descriptions on this. And we tried to make it funny, but also an exercise that would have some value to it. So if you accept at face value, contract managers, procurement officers, purchasing agents, etc., why them and just them? Why not auditors? Why not administrators? Why not nurses or doctors or whoever else that worked for the state? And maybe the answer is, well, you have nursing homes for all these other people. Or maybe the answer is, well, there's something particularly stressful about being in the procurement field or contract management field, more stressful than any other state position. And if that's the case, then maybe you address that as the problem. So these are just things that you could have said. And actually, in some of the past classes, some of the people that did raise these particular points, why are we doing this at all? We understand in the short term we have to keep what we have, but maybe in the long term we shouldn't keep what we have. So that's what they kind of focused on. And so some of the people said they were going to take a two-phase approach. Phase one, cure for the burnout problem, study the issue, hire personnel, better training, etc. Phase two, after you've taken care of the stress issue, why there is burnout, then maybe we can shut down the facility or at least transfer it to another use. So these were just possibilities that have been thrown out in time. And 2 times, 2 projects, etc. If the only focus was on the immediate or short-term problem, none of the above would be examined. If no one ever looked just beyond just seeking the best way to operate the home. And again, I'm not going to tell you that you have the leeway when you're told to do something to come back and necessarily second guess everything you're told to do. But as I've said, you should at least acquaint whomever gave you the issue, the problem, the assignment, with some considerations. And if they tell you, forget it, don't look at anything else, just do what you're told to do, then you probably should just do what you're told to do. But sometimes you won't get that answer. You'll get to, oh, well, that's interesting. Maybe we should. If you don't bring it up, no one else might bring it up themselves. Okay, so, I mean, that's this. We may use the same example for other issues, some that are more particular about, for instance, how to write specifications, etc. So we will use the same scenario for other circumstances, but at least now we're getting you acquainted and we focused on the problem and we'll move on. Okay, so you want to take your seat. We're done for the project for probably the rest of the morning. Yes?
Just had a quick question on the page that had the square footage. Someone had asked a question on my group. What is body holding?
Body holding?
We were just wondering.
What do you think it means?
I have no clue.
Well, it's a morgue, basically. Because in actuality, at Charlotte Hall, there are people that die there. And in any nursing home, there are people that die there. And so I think they currently have capacity for 3 or 4 bodies at one time. So that's what it is. Okay, moving on. So when you get the a critique of this class that you will get on the 5th day, if one of the things that I'm looking for, that we're looking for from you, is some critiquing of the class itself. As I said, this is kind of like a second pilot. We would very much appreciate, and maybe you can't fit it all on that evaluation sheet when you get it, but if you want to send an email or something like that, and if something worked and you want to say, that was really good, we like that, you should continue to. If something didn't work, it's like after you're done with it, you scratched your head and said, I don't know why we went through that. That's something we'd like to know as well. So just keep things like that in mind so that you can give us feedback when it's time for you to critique what we're doing. Now we're going to focus on project planning generically. What is involved in planning for a project? And for planning, you actually plan 3 different aspects of a project. You plan for what we call the planning stage, what you have to do to come up with the plan for everything else. Then there's going to be execution. You plan for how you're going to execute the whatever it is that you're undertaking under the project, and you plan to close out. And I'm saying these generically to begin with, and we'll put more focus from a procurement standpoint very shortly, maybe even the next slide, I'm not sure. Okay, you have planning. Planning leads into the execution, and execution, when you're dealing with a procurement, you have, if you look at the yellow portion, so when you're planning, as I've said yesterday and as Gary said yesterday, you need to focus not just on the procurement itself, but you need to have a great deal of focus on how are you going to get what the procurement is being done for, the end result. And so you need to plan to execute, contract management, and then you need to plan of how you're going to close it out. Close it out either that it's going to end and nothing's going to happen after that, or close out in terms of there's going to be another procurement follows it and you're going to have a transition possibly from one vendor to another. So in the planning phase, when you're planning, you plan for everything in that phase, everything in this phase, and everything in this phase that you reasonably can anticipate. And these are just some of the details that you can read those of what goes. What did I do? Go back. You can read some of the details that you look at in each of these phases that you need to take into consideration in this phase, particular to procurement and contract management. And you should have all these in your slides, this particular part. Are you reading it, or should I go on? Go on? You're reading it. It's blank? That's blank? The yellow and blue aren't there? In other words, they didn't show up? Oh. Oh, I see. You can just barely tell that the blue is there. You can't tell the yellow is there at all. Okay, maybe we will have to print out that as a separate one. Okay, I didn't know that. The page before that.
171 and 172.
Same issue? All right. Okay. So?
We'll probably have that after.
Okay. So, all right, then I'll give you a moment to read that. Focus is how the IMP, that isn't what we call this, so that needs fixed. So if you focus over here, procurement part, the procurement phase of IPPM, 5 to 8 months per overview. So that's how long we said it might take. You focus on the duration, which is frequently 3 years or more, options, etc. Those are things you look at. when you start to close out, lead time, things of this nature. I mean, everything that, these things, as I said, we have 914 slides for the Perform class, and we go into this in excruciating detail in the Perform class. And you'll have these, not that there's anything great there, but we'll give you those after lunch. Same concept we said before, the more now, less later. Generally, the better you anticipate and plan in the planning phase, the less in the procure phase you will need to. Now we're going to say specifically, phase by phase, what better planning typically will help you out in terms of later effort. So when you're doing the procurement, if good planning should allow for better decisions and adaptations. Every now and then I learn to speak. You should lessen the amount of effort you need to involve the integrated procurement project management team, should lessen the time needed to involve the team to make decisions. If you make decisions in advance, then you don't have to come back together during the procure stage to make those same decisions that you've already made. Just a repetition of what we said yesterday. Now moving into the perform stage. Again, the same concept. The better you anticipate and plan in the planning stage, the less in the perform phase you will need to manage the contract. If you have built good contract management tools in at the planning stage, so they're in your solicitation, which means they're in the contract, it makes it easier to manage. It's always harder to manage something that isn't structured to manage it. It's like trying to build something into a building after it's been built that basically had to be built there from the ground up for it to be effective. And sometimes you can do it with a lot of extra time and effort, and sometimes you can't do it at all. Again, the issue of making decisions and adaptations involving the IPPM team, time to make decisions, etc. Again, continuing in perform. And some of the issue I looked at yesterday, that sometimes if you don't have something in a contract or in specifications, and when you're having a contract being performed, and you find out that your vendor and you have differing interpretation of what is required to be performed, sometimes you can get what your interpretation is, and sometimes you can get it only with paying more money, and sometimes you can't get it at all. So the issue, these are the things that good planning up front may help prevent when you're in contract management. What if they don't agree to a desired change? Either you want to do something that you both agree is a change, or you don't think it's a change, but they do. Will they agree to it? When you come to them and say that you want something different, or that something is, from your standpoint, already included in what the vendor's supposed to do, and they tell you that wasn't in their price, and they're only going to do it for a higher price, how good is your contention that it's in the contract to begin with? Because if you're very confident that what you contracted for includes this, then you just tell the vendor to do it, and if they want to file a claim, they file a claim, and hopefully you'll win. But also what you're trying to do with planning and doing things up front the first time properly is prevent things like claims, so that you don't spend a lot of time and effort fighting your own vendors on how to get performance out of a contract. The one thing that you want from a contractor is you want basically a teaming approach. You want them to be on the team with you so that they magnify your efforts and they give you more than what you can do yourself. You don't want to take your very limited time, and we all have very limited time, and spend it denying contract claims and then going to the Board of Contract Appeals defending a contract claim. You have better uses for your time. And lots of times if you planned better, wrote better, made sure things were clearer to begin with, you can eliminate these type of issues when you're in the management of a contract. Sometimes the contractor is not an issue of price, or it's not an issue of understanding, they just don't have the capability to do what it is you want because you didn't say up front what you wanted. Maybe another vendor would have had that capability, but you didn't select that vendor because of some reason you didn't ask for it properly, you didn't do the procurement properly, and now you can't get something you want at the end result. So, and sometimes they are construed to be beyond the scope of the contract, and you can't do anything beyond the scope of the contract. And beyond the scope is a very nebulous term, and you have to have someone interpret what is in scope versus out of scope. You can modify a contract for an activity that is within scope. You are prohibited from modifying a contract to an activity that's outside the scope. And so sometimes that comes down to, is it or isn't it not inside the scope of the contract? And sometimes that's a hard decision, but what we're saying is if you specifically anticipated something and wrote in the contract to begin with even the possibility that you may want to implement something in the future, then it's in scope because it's written into the specifications. So planning can perhaps allow you to do something later. Okay. Do you have this? Something you can read. All right. 10 major reasons of project failure. And this is from 5-Phase Project Management, a Practical Planning and Implementation Guide. It's not something I said. But when we were doing this, we were impressed by this. So let's see if I can read this. The project is a solution in search of a problem. And you can stop and think about that, but sometimes when you get down to it, what are you trying to solve? Well, if you don't know, if you can't put your finger on what it is you're trying to solve, all you know you were told to do something, then it might be construed to be this. You're doing something, but you don't know why you're doing it. So in your contract fulfillment team, maybe that's the thing you come up with. If we're trying to solve the problem, what is the problem? I know what we were told to do, but what are we trying to solve? We can write something better if we know what we're trying to solve, because at this point we don't know. And maybe when you get back to it, the answer will be, well, you're right. It isn't trying to solve anything. Number 2, only the project team is interested in the end result. Somebody needs to be what is called a champion. Someone needs to care whether this thing is done. And if you are a project management team and no one above you cares whether this gets done, the likelihood it's not going to get done, not going to get done properly, not going to get done with sufficient funding because there isn't a concern. And the reason why these things are identified is you look for these telltale signs. And if you can recognize these things as existing, then you know you either need to address it or maybe you need to advise not to do what you're undertaking. Number 3, no one is in charge. That's something that happens frequently. No one can tell anyone else what to do or ask them to do it because you're all equals or whatever, and you can't agree on what to do, and so nothing ever gets done because no one's in charge. That's a problem. The project plan lacks structure. You haven't put together a plan of what you're supposed to do, so you're not focused. You're scattering as far as what you're going to do. What are we trying to solve? What do we do short term? What do we do long term? If you can't get agreement, then you can't focus on trying to solve things. The project plan lacks detail. Structure, detail, I guess they're different. The project is under budgeted. Well, if you know going in that you don't have enough money to do it properly, then it's not going to be a surprise that it's not going to be done properly. And sometimes what you need to do is give the feedback of, there's no sense in doing this because we don't have enough money to get it anything worthwhile, so why don't we just save our time and effort to begin with? And see if you can get more money. If you can't get more money, maybe the thing is, well, then we probably shouldn't do it. And see if you can get concurrence from whoever's giving you the orders to not do it. Insufficient resources. I guess that means in terms of personnel or other circumstances. If you don't have the right people involved in the planning on the contract fulfillment team, then you don't have the right resources to try and make things happen. If you don't have contract management in place, you don't have the right resources to make it happen. The project is not tracked against its plan. It's one thing for you to come up with a plan. And you may come up with a plan that has structure, has depth, has all kind of detail. But then if someone else has to implement it and they simply ignore the plan, then it's almost like, why did you do it to begin with? So that's where you get to contract management. Somebody has to be in place to implement what is being planned. And if you know there's not going to be implementation, it doesn't make sense to plan. The project team is not communicating. I guess that's kind of like no one in charge, but it's like the same thing. No one can get everyone on the same page to be focused on the issue, and the project strays from its original goals. You were told to do one thing, but after you got into your team and started figuring out what you wanted to do, you start going astray a little bit and start going into places where no one wanted you to go, and so that's losing the focus of what you're supposed to be doing. So this is supposedly, from this source, the top 10 reasons for project failure. Now I'm going to throw something else out that I didn't write. I don't know who did. But when you're doing planning, you're supposed to be smart. Now that sounds very good. I think we all want to be smart. So what that stands for from an acronym standpoint: specific. Be specific in targeting an objective. What are you trying to solve? Measurable. Establish a measurable indicator or indicators of progress. How are you going to know if you're making progress to achieving the objective? Assignable. Make the objective capable of being assigned to someone for completion. And this is a key issue. Someone has to be in charge of doing things. They have to be responsible for doing things. If no one's responsible, then what frequently happens is, since it's nobody's responsibility, no one does it. And we have a slide, and maybe the next one, that kind of goes into that on a little humorous basis. Realistic. State what can realistically be achieved within budgeted time and resources. Let's get real. Okay, you told me we have X amount of money, that's all we have, we can't get any more, and we know that's not going to do what you want of the global project, so why don't we reduce the scope of the project to what we have funding for, and let's agree that we're going to do something that's meaningful within the amount of funds, rather than try and do something that's way too broad that won't give us anything effective for the amount of money we have. And time-related, state when the objective can be achieved, that is the duration. Well-written, smart objectives are essential for successful project management. So a little things to look at when you're trying to figure out how to do a procurement, how to get a solution through a contract. Oh, actually I think, well, I said these. I didn't even know we're going that way. Now here we have the story of everybody, somebody, anybody, and nobody. So, I'm going to read this. There once was an important job that everybody was asked to participate in. Anybody could have done it and thought of doing it, but never got around to it. Somebody thought it should be done, but didn't do it because it was everybody's job. Everybody thought that anybody could do it, and anybody thought that if it was that easy, everybody would have done it long ago. It ended up that everybody blamed somebody when actually nobody should have been blamed by anybody. We needed a laugh at that point, didn't we? So maybe this is the shorthand for, specifically for that. And that's what you need to keep in mind. Somebody needs to be in charge. Someone needs to be responsible. Someone needs to be able to assign things and say, you do this part, you do that part, you do the other part. When can you have it done? And then track it, find out if they're doing it, make adjustments, etc. Hand. Time. Okay, isn't it nice we got through that? And I thank you for letting me know that we have break time, so 15 minutes, come on back.